Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Dr. Shaun Grassel's presentation on non-lethal methods for wildlife management. Dr. Grassel is the Chief Wildlife Biologist for the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe, and he's worked with them for 25 years on the conservation and management of wildlife species. Shaun has a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science from South Dakota State University and a PhD from the University of Idaho. Shaun also manages a 150 head cow-calf ranch that also produces native seed grasses. Thank you, Dr. Grassel, for joining us, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Jess, for that introduction. I'm going to cut my video and share my screen. Does that look good?
You're good. Thanks, Shaun.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. As Jess said, my name is Shaun Grassel. I'm a wildlife biologist for the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe. I'm also an enrolled member of the tribe. I work on a variety of wildlife-related issues, everything from research to monitoring game species and focal non-game species. I get to be involved with formulation of policy and assisting in the administrative duties of our department. One of the things I'll just add before I get into my presentation is I was able to, I grew up on the reservation, and I grew up in a really unique, beautiful area, and I was able to do both my master's research and my research for my PhD, but basically in the area surrounding my home, and that's something I'll always be very, very grateful for. But what I wanted to visit with everybody about today is some of the things that we've done at Lower Brule regarding non-lethal methods for wildlife management. There are a lot of people doing a lot of different things, around with regards to non-lethal methods of wildlife management. So I'm just going to share with you what we're doing at Lower Brule. And so just an outline of my presentation is I just wanted to share quickly where we're located and a little bit about our overall program. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe or the location of the Lower Brule Indian Reservation. But I also wanted to then just jump right into some of the things that we're doing with beaver, prairie dogs, and coyotes. And then I'll definitely leave some time for questions for everyone. The Lower Brule Indian Reservation, it's located in central South Dakota. Part of our boundary is located in the center of the old channel of the Missouri River. So this is a very simplified version of our reservation. It's actually quite complicated because of the land use patterns. It's a very checkerboarded situation with different types of land ownership. So it kind of creates some challenges sometimes in terms of wildlife management and jurisdictions and things. But our reservation is about 245,000 acres in size. It's a relatively small reservation compared to some of the other larger reservations in the Great Plains. As far as our program, we have a director. I'm the wildlife biologist. We have a habitat biologist, an assistant biologist who helps both the habitat biologist and myself. We have 2 administrative assistants. We have 3 conservation officer positions, and we have a bison manager. And during the summer months, we'll hire anywhere from 3 to 10 seasonal habitat technicians and 3 to 20 seasonal wildlife technicians. We have basically kind of 5 areas of our program. Wildlife management, of course, is the kind of largest component of our program. I mentioned earlier, we focus on monitoring game species, focal non-game species, conduct research, things of that nature. Another big part of our program is habitat mitigation and restoration, because we're along the Missouri River and we've lost a lot of habitat because of the dams and the creation of the reservoirs. We do a lot of work to replace that habitat that was lost. We have a very popular hunting program. And along with that, we have law enforcement staff that makes sure hunters and anglers follow our wildlife enforcement codes. We also manage about 350 head of bison, and we have since the mid-70s. And we also have some responsibilities for recreation. Since we're along the Missouri River, We manage some sites or kind of primitive areas for people that want to fish from shore or launch boats from shore. And we also have some recreation areas that are more developed that provide, opportunities for families to picnic and fish cleaning stations and things like that. But jumping into some of the things that we do for wildlife management in terms of non-lethal management strategies. One of the things that we work on occasionally are beaver translocations. And this isn't something that we do a lot of. It's something that probably we do every 2 to 3 years. But beaver are a keystone species. And so we want to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do, creating habitat for other species. And so they are a focal species in our conservation plan. We don't have a lot of beaver on the reservation. We have some that are along the Missouri River and their tributaries, and we occasionally get some in stock dams. But they can be perceived as a nuisance. They can do some kinds of damage. When we get them in stock dams, they can create a bank den or a bank lodge, which sometimes will kind of threaten the integrity of the stock dam. We've had issues with plugged culverts. Of course, we have issues with trees being felled over roads or over the top of fences. And we seem to have this uncanny relationship between cottonwood trees that bald eagles use as nesting sites and beaver damage. And we don't have a lot of nesting bald eagles and we don't have a lot of beaver, but for some reason, we quite often have eagle nests that are killed or felled by beaver activity. And so this is when we step in and decide to do a translocation. Sometimes there are complaints from ranchers or producers. They like seeing the trees and creeks. Some of these trees are several hundred years old, and to see them knocked down is something that a lot of people don't like. They provide shade for livestock. So again, producers can lose shade when beavers knock down trees. But then of course, we're interested in keeping beaver on the landscape because they're important species for wildlife conservation and they provide habitat for others. And so this is just, an example of a beaver pond. It's kind of hard to see, but this area here is kind of a small dam that's kind of a half circle. But what you can't see, and I didn't do a very good job taking a picture here, is that this beaver knocked down a tree and it toppled the fence. And so the producer in this case was kind of upset that he was gonna have to repair a fence and that his cattle could get out and things like that. So we came in and set some traps and caught the culprit and relocated it in an area where we felt there would be very, very little chance of damage or conflict. And so this picture is just an example of we find a spot where we could release this individual. It's an old lodge. It was built on the side of a bank under the root of a oak tree, and we have many different kinds of traps. They all operate the same. They're cage traps. But anyway, it allows us to capture and then move this individual without taking him out of the trap, and then we release them. So this is something that takes, very few resources relative to other projects. This is something we can do in relatively short period of time. If there's an issue, we have the equipment. One person can handle this pretty easily, pretty quickly. We may move, 1 to 4 or 5 beaver out of an area, and so it's something that can be done, relatively quickly with few resources. We want to contrast that some of the work we've done with prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are on the opposite end of the spectrum. So prairie dogs are a keystone species. We have black-tailed prairie dogs on our reservation, so they form dense colonies. The colonies, they clip the vegetation and eat vegetation, and so it creates habitat for a lot of other species. But they're also perceived as doing damage to the landscape. They compete with cattle for forage. And so for that reason, they're perceived as a nuisance. from a lot of people, especially ranchers and producers. And so this is something that we've done on several occasions over the last probably 8-9 years, where we've stepped in and done a translocation in an area where prairie dogs are creating conflict, and we move them to areas where we think that they won't create a conflict. And so we're doing this for a lot of reasons. I mentioned they're Keystone species. So, we're interested in species conservation for prairie dogs because of, their importance they have in the landscape, but also we're interested in conserving the species that are associated with prairie dogs or species that depend on prairie dogs. And so I've had the opportunity to work on all of these species over the years. I was able to do some research on the relationship between badgers and prairie dogs. And out of that research, we demonstrated that in prairie dog ecosystems, badgers, which are normally considered a generalist species, they behave much like a specialist. Whereas most of the locations of radio-collared animals that I had occurred on prairie dog colonies. When you look at their home ranges, most of the area or the volume of their home ranges occur on prairie dog colonies. And when they're on prairie dog colonies, of course, their diet is comprised mainly of prairie dogs, and they also select for the high burrow density areas on those colonies. So they behave much like a specialist. And so prairie dog colonies are really important to badgers in that way. Another species that we worked on are greater prairie chicken. Several years ago, we kind of carved out part of our reservation. We created a 55,000 acre census block. And so for 2 consecutive years, we went out during the spring when male prairie chicken are on their leks, and we tried to find every single lek that was out there. And during that process, and this is something that we had always kind of believed or knew, that there was this strong association between greater prairie chicken and prairie dog colonies for their lekking sites. And in this 55,000 acre block, there were somewhere between 20 and 25 prairie dog colonies, and nearly every single one had a prairie chicken lek on them. Prairie chicken don't need prairie dog colonies to lek on, but they definitely select for them when they're available. Another species that we had the opportunity to work on over the years is the chestnut-colored longspur. They prefer short grass areas in large landscapes, with a very homogeneous landscape around them. And they're somewhat colonial or somewhat territorial. And so if you find one, you're going to find 5 or 6, and then you won't see any on the landscape for several miles, at least in our area. But chestnut-colored longspurs in our area are more commonly found on prairie dog colonies than anywhere else, and that's important because their range is shrinking, their populations are in decline. So keeping habitat that they prefer out there is really important for them. Of course, there's a very close association between burrowing owls and prairie dogs. I really don't need to probably discuss that any further. There's just that strong association between those 2 species. One of the species that we've been involved in for a number of years is reintroducing black-footed ferrets to tribal lands. And so black-footed ferrets, they're a specialist, a prairie dog specialist, and so they absolutely need prairie dogs for their burrows, and most of their diet is comprised of prairie dogs. And so I'm making this into a long story, but this is kind of sets the stage of why we think finding ways to conserve prairie dog, which includes translocation techniques, is really important. And so this is kind of an overshot of what we do. These small prairie dog colonies over here, those are the recipient colonies, and these are colonies that plagued out in 2011. So we had some pretty serious plague epizootics in 2011 and also in 2013. 2011 epizootic just occurred in a few colonies, and so we wanted to reestablish those colonies because those colonies are places where we had reintroduced black-footed ferrets. So we wanted to keep those colonies on the landscape for the purpose of the black-footed ferret recovery. And so we captured we captured prairie dogs on on colonies where they were perceived as a nuisance, where we were getting some complaints, where their populations were very robust, and we moved them to 3 different sites. This is just an example of what we did during 1 year of translocating. We did this project in 2012, and so this was a year after our epizootic that occurred, and so most of the prairie dog colonies still had those, prairie dog colony characteristics. The grass was short, there were lots of burrow openings, there were prairie dog mounds. They looked just like a prairie dog colony would, except there weren't any prairie dogs in those areas. And so we contrast that with other translocation projects that we've been involved in, where it's been several years since those plague epizootics occur, and they really don't have the appearance of a prairie dog colony anymore. The grass has grown back to mid grasses rather than short grasses. Burrow openings collapse, and so it takes a lot of extra effort to do a translocation in this kind of scenario. And so in the background, you can see that I'll kind of walk you through what this kind of translocation is like. But the first step is kind of preparing your recipient site, or the area that you want to establish. And so we first had to mow this area to knock the grass down, because prairie dogs don't like tall vegetation. And because the burrows had collapsed, we had to use dirt augers to reopen some of those burrow openings or create new kind of artificial burrows. And so this requires a lot of effort. So we had a crew from the Prairie Dog Coalition of the U.S. Humane Society come in to assist with this project. It took several days, but we managed to move several hundred prairie dogs, and we did this project for 2 consecutive years. And to kind of back up a little bit, how do we catch prairie dogs when we're ready to move them? We primarily use cage traps, and we bait them with oats or a commercial like horse sweet mix that has molasses pellets in it. Or we can use like a water evacuation technique. We're basically kind of flooding the prairie dogs out of burrows. This is more effective on small colonies or small areas. If we have a large area to cover to translocate prairie dogs from, we'll primarily use traps. But there's dishwashing detergent that's mixed in with the water, so it creates a lot of foamy suds. And so when the prairie dogs experience that, all that water coming in, all the foam, they want to get out of there. And so as soon as they come to the surface, they're just grabbed by hand and then put into cages for transportation. This project in particular, we had a research component to it. We wanted to look at not only survival of prairie dogs that were moved, but also movements after prairie dogs were released. And so there's a lot of effort that goes into moving kind of family groups. And so, prairie dogs on a prairie dog colony have territories that contain members of the same family. And so the idea is to move those family groups together. And so you're releasing family groups together. And so they have similar neighbors as they did on their source colony. And so we wanted to see what kind of movements there were after kind of this very kind of intensive moving and capture method. And we wanted to see if animals kind of still stuck together. And so we anesthetized each prairie dog, implanted them with microchips so we could get locations in the future, and to just kind of try to answer some of those questions. And of course, after they recover from their anesthesia, at least in this case, we put them in these travel kennels. There might be 4, 5, 6 prairie dogs in there in each kennel, and we take them out to the release site. So this is a project that probably takes a year to plan for. It takes a lot of resources, both financial resources. It takes a lot of time to do, and it requires a lot of people, so a lot of boots on the ground. So this isn't something that we can just, someone calls us up on the phone and has a complaint or a conflict with prairie dogs. This isn't something that we can just turn around and do next week or next month. It requires quite a bit of coordination and resources. The next project I wanted to visit about or share with you all is some of the work that we've done more recently with coyotes. Coyotes, and you might wonder why I have a picture of a herd of pronghorn on here, and I'm going to get to that. But in our area, coyotes are now the apex predator. Historically they were not. Historically we had wolves on the prairie, grizzly bears on the prairie, elk and bison. And so having wolves and other predators on the landscape kept coyote numbers in check. And so that allowed, other species to kind of flourish. But our ecosystem is kind of unbalanced, if you will. We don't have those larger predators. And so coyotes are our apex predator. And because they're not kept in check naturally, we tend to have, what's commonly thought as, high coyote populations, and which then in turn can, they will, they're predators. So we can have problems with, predation on, livestock calves, mule deer and white-tailed fawns, or, pronghorn kids. And so the method that we looked into was surgical sterilization. I'm going to get more into that with future slides. But the backstory to this project is pronghorn. And over the years, what we saw was a declining pronghorn population in our area. And these numbers are quite small, but we're at the eastern end of the range of pronghorn. We're along the Missouri River, and so as you get closer to the Missouri River, there's not as much suitable habitat. And so our pronghorn are on the western boundary of the reservation. We share a common boundary with private landowners, but also the Fort Pierre National Grasslands. And so we get these occasions where we're seeing fewer pronghorn, then we'll see a rather large increase the next year, and that's more likely because a herd of pronghorn or a few herds of pronghorn were on kind of our side of the fence during that year's survey. And then, maybe the following year they were on the other side of the fence. But what we saw was this general trend of fewer pronghorn, and then also a kind of a diminishing distribution. And the South Dakota Department of Game Fish and Parks has management units on, or I shouldn't say on, but adjacent to and near the reservation. And their trends were very, very similar to ours, actually even a little bit more striking in our data. So that was the backstory to our coyote work. And so as a manager, you start noticing these trends, and you think, well, what is causing these trends? What could the possible factors be for a declining pronghorn population? And so we set out to better understand that. And so we wanted to look at, pronghorn survival of both adults and pronghorn kids, and just try to understand what was going on out there. And so over 2 years, we captured 54 adult pronghorn. We fitted them with GPS collars so we could monitor their movements, but also monitor their survival. And what we found out after a few years of the study is that they had a very high survival rate, with the exception of 1 year where we had an episodic hemorrhagic disease, which typically kind of shows up in whitetails, but we had a kind of an increase during one summer of mortalities. But for the most part, our mortality rates were very low, very normal, I guess very comparable to what you'd see in the literature and other places. So this didn't give us a cause for alarm. But we can compare that to some of the pronghorn kid work. Over the 5 years, we captured 136 kids, fitted them with VHF collars, and then monitored them for survival. And on average, over those 5 years, 60% of those kids were killed by coyotes. So of course, this kind of was very interesting and somewhat alarming to us. And so, this highly suggested that coyotes were one of the primary factors in our pronghorn decline. And so when you come to this kind of realization, as a manager, you think, well, what are our options? What do we do now? And so of course our options were, one, we could do nothing, just let things play out, which we were not interested in. The other option was we could do some, intensive coyote control. So we could try to kind of kill our way out of the situation and try to reverse that trend. Thinking about those kinds of options, you could do it kind of strategically and try to have the least amount of impact on the coyote population, by just focusing on, certain areas or certain animals, certain times of the year. And so we gave that some thought. But one of the things we've always tried to do with wildlife management, when we have options on the table that include a non-lethal alternative, if we can implement that non-lethal alternative, that's what we will try to do. And I should add that that's not always possible. I talked about the resources that are required earlier, like for a prairie dog translocation. So those are things that sometimes we always have to take those things into consideration of, like, how much work does it take? What are our resources? What can we feasibly do, under those circumstances? But when it came to our pronghorn issue and our questions about coyotes, we looked into other methods, so non-lethal methods. So coyote sterilization is something that is in the literature. Some studies have reported being able to increase, survival of pronghorn kids. Other research has been done it has shown that it's, improved survival of lambs, domestic sheep. So this is something we wanted to try. And so we're able to raise some money to implement this kind of project. And this is a project that takes a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of financial resources, and a lot of partnerships to really pull this off. And so the backstory, or the theory behind this is, coyotes generally prey on small mammals, mice, rabbits, carrion, things of that nature. And so foraging theory tells us that, or suggests that, there's low risk, with that kind of diet. There's low reward because those food items are small, but there's little risk involved with taking down those animals or hunting those animals, and to satisfy their energetic requirements. But as during the breeding season, as female coyotes get bred, they become pregnant, they're in utero raising those pups, their energetic demand goes up. When they have those pups, they're lactating, their energetic demands go up even higher. And so then they have mouths to feed and a very large energetic demand. So they will switch to larger prey items like pronghorn kids. So the idea is that if you can prevent coyotes from having pups or having a litter, those energetic demands will remain relatively low, and so they shouldn't have that tendency, or they should lower that tendency to switch to larger prey items like pronghorn kids or deer fawns. And so that's the steps that we took. We had a helicopter come in. We did try to catch some from the ground. And this is a really tricky, kind of complicated project in terms of implementing it, because we want to catch coyotes as close to the time period when pronghorn kids are having, or pronghorn does are having their kids, because we want to reduce the amount of time that coyotes are out there in the landscape where they could be harvested by hunters. And but that's also complicated by weather conditions and field conditions and trying to capture those animals. And so we're trying to capture those animals in February. Of course, the ground is frozen. We have freezing and thawing. So that's not very conducive to trapping on the ground. And we use foothold traps, and we also use neck snares. We had limited success. Of course, there's some issues involved with just kind of animal welfare issues with that kind of method of capture. So we ended up bringing in a helicopter and to finish out our capture. So we caught 7 from the ground, 25 with a helicopter, and took those animals to a vet and had them surgically sterilized. And so females basically have hysterectomies, and so their ovaries are left intact, they're left in the body, but the fallopian tubes and uteruses are removed. The males basically just receive a vasectomy. And so the idea is to keep all those hormonal cues in check And so the idea is to not change their behaviors in any way. We also put GPS collars on the coyotes, and that allowed us to a couple things to gain a little bit more information on movements of coyotes and how they use the landscape. But then also it allowed us to the coyotes and their locations during the pronghorn parturition period, so that period when they're dropping their kids and raising their kids on the ground, the collective locations of the coyotes kind of became our study area. And so the year after we did the coyote sterilization, we saw a very interesting contrast in our kid survival. So within our study area, 71% of the kids that we collared survived, compared to 32% of kids survival, or kids that survived outside of our study area. And when we do our fall recruitment surveys from an aircraft, within that study area, we kind of are estimated 52 kids per 100 does, and outside of that study area, 32 kids per 100 does. And so I have to caveat all of this by saying that this is 1 year's worth of data. We have a very small sample size. Like I said, we don't have a whole lot of pronghorn on the reservation. The number of kids we captured this year was 32 kids. And so that's not a large sample size. And so what we wanted to do is to monitor the effects of this treatment over the years to see what kind of effect it would have, by having those sterilized coyotes on the landscape. It's a one-time treatment. You don't have to do it every single year. But then continuing to monitor pronghorn kids each spring for their survival. So initially, this project looked like we were on the right track in kind of curtailing the decline and increasing survival of pronghorn kids. That would lead to increase in recruitment, and we were hopeful that it would, increase, eventually lead to, increases in our population. But what we experienced this last year was kind of was somewhat expected, but somewhat also frustrating, is that we lost a lot of coyotes this last year to recreational hunter, trappers and hunters, but also we had some disperse rather long distances from our study areas. So they're basically lost to our study. We also lost a fair amount of animals to South Dakota Game Fish and Parks control efforts that are in our area. And so coming into this year, we only had about, I think, a dozen coyotes on the landscape on the reservation in our study area. And then we went out and captured pronghorn kids again. This year we put GPS collars on them, which was something new and different. But we're kind of back to where we started from. I think the last check we've lost, something like 60-some% of our kids this year, and most of that is due to coyote predation. So it seems like this is something that keeping our coyotes alive, keeping our coyotes out there in the landscape is the most challenging part of this project. It's expensive. We're able to raise the money to do it. We're able to carve out some time to do it. But in order to do this successfully, we would have to capture coyotes each year, surgically sterilize coyotes, release those coyotes back on the landscape, just because the turnover or the mortality in coyotes was high, kind of unexpectedly higher than what we thought. And so then that kind of makes this project one of those projects, something like some of our prairie dog work. It's going to require a lot of resources in the future. It's something that if we can raise the money to do it more often, we'll certainly do that. But it's not a project where we thought we could do kind of a one treatment and see the effects or see the benefits of it, over the course of maybe 3 years or something like that. It's definitely something that's going to have to occur annually. But it's another tool in our toolbox. We've demonstrated that we can have some what appears to be some benefits to it. And so it's something, as we look forward, trying to figure out how we can implement this more often, kind of given the large resources that it requires. And that's what I had as far as our work at Lower Brule. And so I kind of wanted to thank everyone for joining in today. We have time for questions. I'll shut down this PowerPoint and turn it back over to Jess, I believe.
Thanks so much, Shaun. We appreciate your time. We're going to be moving into our question and answer section.
Okay, we have one question so far. Randy and Pam, ask your question.
Hi, we were just wondering why the cottonwood trees with eagle nests weren't identified and simply protected by wire caging. That way you could allow beavers to remain at the site and they could help provide water resources for livestock.
Right. So when we moved some beaver because they were starting to girdle a tree, we felt we were trying to get in and out of there as quickly as possible. We didn't want to disturb the bald eagles that were nesting there. And we have done what you're describing many times in several places on the reservation, wrapping wire or wrapping flashing around the base of trees that are starting to get damaged by beaver. But in this particular case, they're nesting eagles above. We didn't want to disturb them any more than we had to. So we felt setting a trap, kind of downstream from where they were at, where there was some beaver activity, it would be less invasive and just less intrusive on the eagles that were nesting.
Next question, Bill, ask your question, please.
Yeah, Shaun, I have two term questions. I'm assuming apex predator means the primary or the top predator. And
Yeah.
also I keep seeing this term keystone. I don't understand what that means.
Keystone species. Keystone species are species that create habitat for other species. And so, beaver and prairie dog are two really good examples. Prairie dogs, through their digging and burrowing and clipping behavior and the way they're colonial, it attracts other species that are kind of linked to those habitats. And so, the relationship between prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets is probably the best example out there. Prairie dogs create habitat for, ground nesting birds, tiger salamanders, prairie rattlesnakes. Beaver create habitat for, wood ducks, mink, things like that. And so they're species that through their behaviors of manipulating the habitat are creating habitat that's needed by other species.
Okay, thanks. And the apex predator, that's the chief or the primary or the top predator?
Yeah, basically it's kind of the top dog, so to speak. And so they kind of regulate other populations.
Okay, all right.
And I mentioned historically coyotes weren't. Through intraguild predation, wolves probably kept coyotes in check, and so their populations were probably much lower. Now coyotes are the main, the apex predator, and so that not only has implications as far as predation on pronghorn kids and deer fawns, but also will have implications of other mesocarnivores. And so like in our area, we don't often see other mesocarnivores like long-tailed weasels or spotted skunks and species of that size. And it's because of that intraguild predation and that relationship, that competition that exists between those gills.
Okay, thanks.
Linda, please ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much. I think you kind of answered it, but I was going to ask why coyotes were such a problem for the antelope when they haven't been historically, but it's because there are no wolves or mountain lions to keep the coyotes in check. So I assume there's no political will or desire to reintroduce wolves there, so there's no question that you just have to control the coyotes because there's no possibility of having a bigger or greater apex predator in the mix. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that, I need to add, we're at the edge of the range of pronghorn, and in the literature, the research, the research papers that are out there, pronghorn near the edge of the range seem to have lower recruitment rates, lower rates of survival, things of that nature. And so there are other kind of dynamics that occur, like with small populations, things that call allele effects. And so when that population starts to become small, some of the survival rates go down, reproductive rates go down. The other kind of complicating issue is that our reservation is quite, in our adjacent lands, we're quite checkerboarded. So we have large blocks of rangeland, but we also have large blocks of land that have been converted to agriculture. And so pronghorn will use, all of those land types, but of course they prefer rangelands. And so what could be happening, this is something we haven't dug too deeply in, but the loss, this is a historic loss of rangeland in that area. It's kind of congregating the pronghorn into smaller patches on the landscape, which then might make them more susceptible to predation, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a complicated, situation, I guess, out there where, coyotes are the kind of the proximate cause of, they're preying on pronghorn kids. But another complicating issue is just the smaller land base that they have to use.
Okay, we have a question that came in. Let me see. Someone wanted you to discuss, he said that as found in Yellowstone, wolves will depress coyote populations. Is that correct? Something you can discuss?
Yeah, that kind of goes back to that historical relationship. And so when wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone, that's one of the things that was documented, is that wolves kind of take over the area and they outcompete like the next smallest guild. So in cases in Yellowstone, it's coyotes. And so coyotes are kind of forced to kind of live in the periphery of, wolf pack territories rather than having full access to the landscape. They're just kind of living in these crevices and cracks between wolf pack territories. And so it's something that's been documented in the literature, and Yellowstone National Park is a great example.
All right, thank you. Do we have any more questions? Okay.
Thank you so much, Shawn. We really do appreciate all the time that you've afforded us. I have worked with you firsthand, so I know the impact that your work makes on wildlife. What people may not know is that you are self-funded. For the last 15 years, you have raised all the funding that you need to do all the work that you are currently doing. So I think my personal question I would like to ask is, you talked a bit about how you would like to do this study every year with coyotes to really get a good read on how that works. Is that a project that you're working on currently? Are you going to move into the next year and the year after, hoping to do this again and again?
Yes, and so that's one thing I didn't mention, but this last winter, we attempted to do another round, if you will, of coyote capture and coyote sterilization. Because the way we proposed this project to our funders was that we wanted to look at pronghorn kid survival over 3 years. And so because we had so many mortalities of coyotes during our first year, we collected the collars off those coyotes. Those collars still have, another year's worth of battery life in them. So we wanted to redeploy those collars. And so we wanted to recapture coyotes this winter, sterilize them, get those collars back out so we could continue to study this. Unfortunately, this last winter, we did catch 3 animals from the ground, but under pretty challenging field conditions. I contacted several helicopter companies to try to get a helicopter crew there to capture coyotes again for us. And this year, it just didn't work out logistically and economically to get a helicopter capture company in there. Looking forward, we still have another year worth of capturing pronghorn kids and evaluating this. And so looking forward to this year, yeah, that's something that we're planning on doing, is redeploying those collars that we have available to us. It's going to get a little bit more complicated and more difficult looking forward, because the collars that were deployed 2 years ago, they're still active, but between now and a year from now, many of those collars will start to expire. And so we won't have a good handle on the number of coyotes that are out there. Those coyotes won't be able to inform us of the study area of where the locations are of the animals that are all sterilized. So we'll continue to try to do this as we move forward. It's a little bit more complicated. And of course, that might affect our ability to kind of interpret results in the future. But we are still moving forward in that direction.
That's great to hear. Thank you. And just so that people maybe get some insight into what this work is like for you as a biologist on the ground or in the air doing this kind of work, what for you is the most personally challenging thing that you have to encounter when you're out there?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's always challenging, just time. We have a lot of projects that go on. We have our regular monitoring that we do. We're doing research, or on other species. We're reintroducing black-footed ferrets. And when we want to do a project like this, we need to be able to fit it into our schedule. And then the monitoring that goes involved, that's involved with this, we need to also kind of fit that into our schedule of our field work. And so finding the time to do some of these projects is probably some of the biggest challenges. I mean, it's challenging to raise the funding to do it. But once we have funding, it's we always have to put it on a calendar and see if we can do it. If we have the funding, can we pull it off given the time constraints that we have because of our other work?
Fair enough. And I think we have some questions that actually came in while you and I were chatting. So I'm going to go ahead and let those folks ask their questions.
Shaun, I don't know if you can hear me. It's Bill again.
Yep.
In spite of the horrific laws that were trying to be passed that were passed in Montana and Idaho to slaughter 85 to 90% of the wolves, is there any effort to reintroduce wolves in your area?
No, there's not.
And is it pointless or hopeless to think that they might be because of all the hunters and everything?
Yeah, I think it is. It's a non-starter for sure. We don't have wilderness areas. We don't have large blocks of public land, and those public lands are used for cattle grazing, and most of South Dakota is private land, and so wolf reintroduction in my area is probably never going to happen.
Wow. Okay, thanks.
All right, so we had some questions typed in. Someone says, Shaun, thank you for your informative presentation. Of all of your projects, what do you consider the most critical to address climate change, if there is one that stands out?
We haven't done a lot in that regard. Looking forward, one of the things we wanted to do is to do more work with beaver restoration and beaver mimicry and building the beaver dam analogs and things like that, and of course that has some climate change mitigation components to it, but we haven't got there yet. That's one thing that our department hasn't done enough to address, is to implement projects that have a direct climate change aspect to it. hopefully sometime in the future we'll get there, but we haven't got there yet.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Is the landscape heavily grazed by cattle, thereby exposing kids to danger?
It's not, I wouldn't say that it is grazed. I wouldn't say that it's overgrazed. You know, our lands are managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they kind of have a take half, leave half philosophy. And so they set the stocking rates for livestock grazing very conservatively. And actually our grasslands are in pretty good shape. And adjacent to us, where a lot of this work occurs, is on the Fort Pierre National Grasslands. And it's a very similar situation where the grass is, you know, it's grazed by cattle, but it's done so in a very conservative manner. One of the things that we have seen, and I showed a picture of, is during the parturition period when pronghorn are having their kids, they use a lot of bare ground, you know, fields that were harvested last year and are in the process of being planted this year. And so they're out there in sunflower stubble and sometimes, you know, sorghum stubble or winter wheat fields. So that was something that was somewhat surprising. But getting back to the question about the grasses and grazing, it's the grasslands are actually in really good shape.
And then I think we have one last question. It says, citizen scientists can manage the data collection and cataloging. Have you asked them for support?
I have not. That's something we should consider.
Okay, it looks like that was our last question. So I'll hand it over to Jessica.
Well, again, Shawn, thank you so much for being here. And I also want to thank all of our attendees. These educational programs share so much knowledge with our supporters, and so we thank them all for taking time to be here and for supporting those programs. For our next events, please look at our events page on mountainlion.org. And we're going to say goodbye to Dr. Grassel, and thank you for your time.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Shawn.